She said my garden was too messy. But what happened next will shock every neighbor: fire. Imagine this: a wildflower garden sparks outrage in a neighborhood obsessed with perfection. One nosy Karen files complaint after complaint, determined to enforce her idea of beauty. But the homeowner digs into the HOA rules, and what happens next isn't just a win, it's a complete takeover that Karen never saw coming. Will the garden survive? Can one person outsmart a relentless HOA and a neighborhood bully? Watch as rules, strategy, and patience turn the tables in a story of revenge, victory, and unstoppable creativity. Chapter 1: The Garden That Broke the Silence. Spring had arrived in the neighborhood with its usual sense of renewal. Everywhere you looked, lawns were being trimmed, hedges shaped into stiff cubes, and bags of fertilizer spread across already immaculate grass. The community prided itself on uniformity, where every house seemed copied from the next, each yard reflecting the same narrow standard of beauty. But one home dared to be different. Instead of the sterile perfection of endless green blades, the front yard was alive with color and movement. Patches of golden black-eyed Susans danced in the breeze beside swaths of purple coneflowers. Lavender stood tall, releasing its fragrance into the air, while clusters of daisies bent lazily toward the morning sun. Butterflies flitted from bloom to bloom, bees hummed their chorus, and even the occasional hummingbird darted in, sipping nectar before vanishing into the air. It was not just a yard, it was an ecosystem. The homeowner had chosen this path deliberately. Tired of endless mowing, chemical treatments, and the artificial chase for a perfect lawn, they wanted something more sustainable, something alive. Every seed planted had a purpose, drawing in pollinators and adding back a touch of wildness to a world that demanded conformity. For them, the garden was not messy. It was vibrant. It was a statement. But not everyone saw it that way. From across the street, Karen stood glaring. Her lawn was the definition of perfection: evenly cut grass, uniform hedges, and not a single weed in sight. She had invested countless hours and dollars into maintaining what she saw as the neighborhood standard, and she expected everyone else to do the same. To her, the wild garden wasn't just untidy, it was a threat. If one neighbor could abandon the pristine grass, what was to stop others from following? Soon enough, whispers began. Karen made her rounds, casually mentioning the unsightly jungle to other homeowners. At first, people brushed it off, but Karen was persistent. Her voice grew louder, her complaints sharper, until finally, she decided to act. She filed the first official complaint with the HOA, citing yard neglect and claiming the garden was in direct violation of community landscaping rules. When the letter arrived, the homeowner felt a surge of frustration. It wasn't neglect. It was intention. Every plant had been chosen carefully, every space designed for beauty and balance. Still, the letter was clear: cut it down, or face fines. Most people would have given in, quietly reverting to grass to avoid conflict. But this homeowner wasn't most people. Instead of immediately reacting, they began to dig deeper. Something about the language of the notice felt off, vague and imprecise. If Karen was so confident that the rules were on her side, perhaps it was time to take a closer look at those very rules. And so, one evening, as the sun dipped behind the rooftops and the garden buzzed with twilight life, the homeowner sat down with the HOA handbook. Every line, every clause, every obscure landscaping guideline was examined with care. They weren't looking for trouble, they were looking for truth. And as the pages turned, an idea began to form. The complaint that Karen had filed might not have been as ironclad as she believed. Hidden in the rules, buried under layers of restrictions and definitions, were loopholes. Not just small ones, but wide openings that could be used not only to defend the garden, but to expand it in ways no one in the neighborhood would see coming. What had begun as a frustrating setback was slowly transforming into an opportunity. Karen had picked a fight, and in doing so, she had awakened a determination that wasn't going to fade. The garden was only the beginning. End of Chapter 1. Next, Chapter 2 will dive into the homeowner's deep dive into HOA regulations and how those hidden rules spark a plan to turn Karen's complaint into her worst nightmare. Chapter 2, digging into the rulebook. As the evening deepened, the quiet hum of the garden became the soundtrack to a meticulous investigation. The homeowner spread the HOA handbook across the dining table, its pages crisp but dense, each line a potential weapon or obstacle. Every clause, every subsection, every vague sentence mattered. What looked like a simple complaint on paper now had the weight of strategy behind it. Karen had assumed the rules were on her side, that a complaint citing yard neglect would automatically pressure compliance. But HOA documents, as the homeowner discovered, were a maze of loopholes and outdated definitions, written years ago and often ignored or misinterpreted. The term acceptable landscaping appeared repeatedly but was never clearly defined. Were native wildflowers considered neglect? Or were they merely different from the strict visual standard that Karen idolized? Hours passed as the homeowner cross-referenced citations, previous complaint records, and community meeting minutes. Notes were scribbled in the margins, color-coded to separate potential strengths from weaknesses. They discovered past instances where homeowners had faced similar complaints but had successfully defended themselves, often by pointing to ambiguities in the very rules the HOA relied upon. Each example became fuel for the plan forming in their mind. But strategy alone wasn't enough. Knowledge was power, yes, but precision mattered more. The homeowner realized that Karen's complaint relied heavily on subjective language, unsightly, messy, not in keeping with the neighborhood aesthetic. Those words carried no legal weight, no enforceable consequences unless the HOA's board agreed. And the board, as it turned out, had a history of inconsistent enforcement, often swayed more by neighbor gossip than by documented violations. The homeowner's plan began to take shape. If Karen expected a fight over aesthetics, she had chosen the wrong weapon. By leaning into the technicalities, interpreting rules literally, and highlighting every inconsistency, the homeowner could not only defend the garden, they could fortify it. And perhaps, subtly, turn it into a statement no one could challenge. Late into the night, the research transformed into design. The homeowner mapped the garden on paper, marking each section with the specific code or guideline that protected it. Native plants that could not be legally deemed weeds were clustered strategically. Decorative elements were planned in areas explicitly permitted under HOA guidelines. Every stone, every flower bed, every meandering path became a testament to both beauty and compliance. It was no longer just a garden, it was a legal masterpiece. But Karen wasn't the only obstacle. Other neighbors, previously silent, began to whisper. Some admired the creativity, while others worried that bending the rules might invite chaos. The homeowner considered their perspective, but ultimately knew that precedent and documentation were stronger than opinion. With the handbook as armor and past cases as evidence, no subjective complaint could hold sway. By the time dawn broke, the garden's possibilities had expanded far beyond its original footprint. The homeowner envisioned a jungle of legality, wild yet defensible, chaotic yet untouchable. What had started as a garden simply to bring life to the yard had now become a strategic battleground. And Karen? She had no idea that the complaint she thought would intimidate her neighbor had instead awakened a calculated, methodical response. The homeowner smiled at the irony. Every complaint filed against them had just given them the insight needed to push back harder, smarter, and in full accordance with the law. As the first light of morning filtered through the curtains, illuminating the piles of notes, hand-drawn maps, and highlighted rules, a singular thought emerged. Karen had thrown the first punch, but she hadn't yet seen the counterattack. And when it came, it would be precise, unassailable, and utterly satisfying. The battle lines were drawn. The garden was no longer just a patch of flowers. It was a fortress, a legal labyrinth, a silent but unmistakable statement that this homeowner would not be intimidated. Karen's influence, as it turned out, had limits, and they were about to be exposed. The groundwork was set. Research completed, strategy formed, and rules thoroughly dissected, the homeowner prepared for the next phase. It was time to move from planning to execution, and when that moment arrived, Karen would finally see that her complaints had only strengthened her opponent. End of Chapter 2. Next, Chapter 3 will show the homeowner implementing their plan, leading to the first confrontation and the escalating showdown with Karen and the HOA board. Chapter 3: The Showdown. The day of reckoning arrived like any other suburban morning, yet tension hung in the air heavier than dew. The homeowner's garden, now meticulously mapped against every relevant HOA rule, stood as a silent challenge to Karen's rigid idea of perfection. Every flower, every cluster of native plants, every decorative border had been placed with strategy in mind, transforming the yard into a visual declaration. Creativity and legality could coexist. Karen, of course, had anticipated victory. She strutted down the street, clipboard in hand, ready to document every infraction. Her eyes scanned the garden, noting every irregularity, confident that her complaints had already sealed the outcome. Neighbors whispered among themselves, divided between admiration and curiosity, all aware that this confrontation had escalated beyond casual yard disagreements. Inside the community hall, the HOA board had convened to hear Karen's complaint. Rows of folding chairs were occupied by residents, some curious, some weary of drama. The homeowner entered quietly, binder in hand, the culmination of weeks of research neatly organized into precise evidence. Every citation, every precedent, every clause from the handbook was documented and ready. The atmosphere was electric. Karen's usual confidence faltered slightly when she noticed the homeowner's composed demeanor. Unlike previous targets of her complaints, this individual had clearly prepared. Her complaints, previously wielded like a weapon of intimidation, now seemed vulnerable under the scrutiny of documented rules and structured reasoning. As the board reviewed the complaint, the homeowner began a methodical presentation. While no words were spoken aloud, the effect was felt. Pages were turned, highlighting sections where subjective interpretations had previously been misused. Photographs of the garden's layout, cross-referenced with the HOA guidelines, showed compliance at every turn. Historical examples of other residents' similar landscaping choices were presented, reinforcing the argument that the garden fell within permissible limits. Karen's frown deepened with each page. She had expected a swift condemnation, a quick reprimand, and perhaps a minor correction of the garden. Instead, the narrative had shifted. The evidence wasn't just compelling, it was irrefutable. Every complaint she had filed, every argument she had made, was systematically neutralized by facts and precedent. The board members, some who had previously relied on subjective judgment, now faced undeniable clarity. The homeowner's preparation left little room for debate. The garden wasn't merely aesthetically different, it was legally compliant, documented, and defensible. The subtle power of planning and research had turned the tables entirely. Outside, the tension spilled into the streets as neighbors speculated on the outcome. Whispers circulated: had Karen overplayed her hand? Could her insistence on conformity truly hold against such meticulous preparation? The homeowner remained calm, confident that the rules were on their side, understanding that patience and evidence often outweighed anger and assumption. By the end of the meeting, the board's decision became inevitable. Karen's complaints, once a formidable threat, were dismissed on technical grounds. The garden, far from being messy or unsightly, had been validated as an acceptable expression of landscaping within the community's rules. Karen's face turned crimson, realizing that her plan to control the aesthetic of the neighborhood had failed spectacularly. The homeowner left the hall with quiet satisfaction, aware that the victory was not merely for themselves but a precedent for neighbors who valued individuality. Karen, on the other hand, returned home defeated, her confidence shaken by the realization that rules, evidence, and careful planning could outmatch intimidation. Though the confrontation had ended, it was clear that the war of influence in the neighborhood was far from over. Karen's persistence and tendency to escalate conflicts meant that vigilance would remain necessary. But for the homeowner, the first major victory demonstrated a simple truth: preparation and understanding of the system could turn even the most rigid opposition into a powerless observer. The garden remained untouched, a flourishing testament to ingenuity and resilience. Bees and butterflies continued their work undisturbed, a quiet celebration of victory in color and motion. And while Karen may have struck first, the homeowner had emerged as the strategist, proving that intellect, patience, and meticulous planning could overcome even the most relentless of opponents. The stage was now set for the next confrontation, for Karen was not yet finished, and the homeowner understood that even victories must be defended. The garden was no longer just a space of beauty. It had become a symbol, a challenge, and a battleground for creativity and compliance alike. End of Chapter 3. Next, Chapter 4 will explore Karen's counterattack, escalating the conflict, and testing how far the homeowner can push their clever strategy while remaining within the HOA rules. Chapter 4, Karen Strikes Back. Karen did not take defeat lightly. Her ego had been bruised, her authority questioned, and her narrative of control publicly challenged. To her, the HOA's dismissal of her complaint was not an end, it was an insult, a direct challenge to her influence in the neighborhood. By the next morning, she had already begun plotting her next move. She started subtly at first, knocking on doors, planting seeds of doubt among neighbors. Her language was precise, calculated. The garden, she claimed, might comply with the letter of the rules, but what about the spirit? Was it truly in keeping with the community's image? Some neighbors, wary of conflict but curious nonetheless, whispered in agreement, unsure whether to side with innovation or conformity. Karen's influence, though diminished, still lingered like a shadow over the street. Meanwhile, the homeowner remained vigilant. Though victory had been achieved in the formal sense, there was no underestimating Karen's persistence. Every morning, as sunlight glinted off the blooms in the garden, the homeowner surveyed the yard, noting subtle changes, footprints near flower beds, misplaced garden ornaments, and faint scuffs on the mulch. Karen was testing boundaries, probing for weaknesses, looking for the tiniest infraction to exploit. Determined to stay one step ahead, the homeowner expanded their research. Every HOA bylaw, municipal ordinance, and community guideline was reviewed with renewed attention. Where the first battle had been defensive, this one would require foresight, anticipation, and creative leverage. The garden, already a fortress of legality, needed fortifications, contingency plans, and proof that no subjective complaint could succeed. Karen escalated further, this time appealing directly to the HOA board outside of scheduled meetings. Emails were sent, letters posted, and even phone calls were made, each reiterating her outrage and demanding action. The board, now aware of her previous miscalculations, responded cautiously, aware that any misstep could undermine the community's trust. Karen's attempts to manipulate the system were met with polite resistance, her complaints politely logged but increasingly ignored. The homeowner, observing this escalation, realized that Karen's strategy relied heavily on intimidation and volume rather than substance. Her threats carried weight only if the board or neighbors were swayed by her emotional display. By keeping meticulous documentation, cross-referencing rules, and maintaining transparency, the homeowner had neutralized her primary weapon. Yet Karen's persistence still demanded attention. In response, the homeowner expanded the garden not just aesthetically, but legally. New plantings were chosen specifically because they were mentioned in HOA guidelines as acceptable alternatives. Decorative elements were added in areas clearly permitted under the rules. Even the layout was adjusted slightly to demonstrate compliance while subtly asserting creative autonomy. Every move was calculated, a blend of beauty and strategy that rendered further complaints impotent. The tension between Karen and the homeowner began to ripple outward. Neighbors noticed the ongoing duel, some silently cheering for the homeowner, others wary of taking sides. Community discussions at local events now included whispers about the wild garden and its defender. Karen's reputation, once unchallenged, now faced quiet skepticism. Her complaints, increasingly frequent but ineffectual, only highlighted the homeowner's careful planning and the garden's resilience. Despite her mounting frustration, Karen was not defeated in spirit. She began attending every HOA meeting, questioning other minor issues in hopes of reasserting authority. But the homeowner's documentation and preemptive compliance ensured that these tactics failed. Each attempt Karen made to regain control reinforced the narrative of her overreach, and the community slowly began to recognize the homeowner's cleverness and patience. By the end of the chapter, the stage was set for a pivotal confrontation. Karen's strikes, though persistent, were predictable. The homeowner's defense, though calm, had grown more assertive. The garden, once merely a plot of native plants, had become a symbol of strategic ingenuity and resilience. The next phase would not be subtle, it would involve the community itself, testing alliances, influence, and ultimately, who truly held sway in the neighborhood. The battle was escalating. Karen had struck back, but the homeowner was ready, armed with rules, strategy, and unwavering determination. The showdown was far from over, and both sides were preparing for the moment when the neighborhood would have to choose whose vision of order and beauty would prevail. End of Chapter 4. Next, Chapter 5 will reveal the HOA vote, the community's involvement, and how the homeowner leverages rules and neighbors to secure a decisive advantage. Chapter 5, The Vote. The tension in the neighborhood had reached a palpable peak. The garden, once a simple patch of wildflowers, had transformed into a battlefield of rules, strategy, and influence. Karen's repeated attempts to assert dominance over the HOA were well known, and whispers of the ongoing conflict had spread from one house to the next. Everyone seemed to be waiting for the inevitable clash, and the upcoming HOA vote promised to be the ultimate test of power. The homeowner arrived early at the meeting hall, binder in hand, ready to present their case once more. But this time, it wasn't just about defending the garden. The vote would be a reflection of the community's collective opinion, a chance for the neighbors themselves to decide whether Karen's vision of uniformity or the homeowner's creative compliance would set the standard. Every detail mattered. Every page, every photo, every reference to the HOA guidelines could sway opinions. As residents filled the room, murmurs of anticipation buzzed quietly among them. Some had been watching silently from their windows, some had spoken briefly to Karen, and others had observed the homeowner's careful preparation. The tension was not just between Karen and the homeowner, it was between order and individuality, rigidity and creativity, conformity and freedom. Karen took her usual position near the front, clipboard clutched tightly, radiating confidence and indignation. Her complaints had been persistent, her arguments repetitive, yet she had convinced herself that volume alone could influence the outcome. The homeowner, however, remained calm, confident that evidence, precision, and strategy would carry the day. When the voting process began, it became immediately clear how divided the community was. Some neighbors, sympathetic to Karen's desire for conformity, hesitated. Others, inspired by the homeowner's clever use of the rules and the beauty of the garden itself, quietly supported individuality. Each vote cast carried weight, but the homeowner's meticulous preparation had already created a quiet momentum. In the midst of the vote, subtle but powerful moves made a difference. Visual aids displayed the garden's compliance with HOA bylaws, references to precedent cases demonstrated fairness, and every point of Karen's previous complaints was systematically addressed. Residents could see, clearly, that the homeowner's garden was not just a wild patch of plants, it was a carefully structured example of legal landscaping within the neighborhood's rules. Karen's confidence began to falter as she noticed the subtle nods of approval from neighbors she had expected to support her. Each page turned, each photograph displayed, eroded her narrative. Her insistence that the garden violated community standards appeared increasingly unfounded, especially as neighbors compared it with other yards that had previously been deemed acceptable. The votes were tallied, one by one. The tension in the room was nearly tangible. When the final count was announced, it was clear that the homeowner had not only defended the garden, they had won the majority of the community's support. Karen's objections were formally noted, but her influence was effectively diminished. The vote was a decisive statement: creativity, strategy, and careful adherence to the rules could outweigh intimidation and rigid conformity. Outside the meeting hall, the neighborhood buzzed with a mixture of excitement, relief, and quiet admiration. The garden, untouched and flourishing, had become a symbol of resilience. Bees and butterflies continued their work as if oblivious to human disputes, while the homeowner surveyed the scene with satisfaction. The battle, it seemed, had shifted. Karen's strikes had been countered, and the homeowner's careful planning had won the day. Yet even in victory, there was caution. Karen was persistent and unpredictable. While the vote had favored the homeowner, the possibility of further conflict lingered. The garden's success was not merely about beauty, it was about understanding rules, leveraging community support, and maintaining vigilance against future challenges. As the sun set on the neighborhood, the homeowner walked among the wildflowers, noting how each plant now seemed to shimmer with quiet triumph. Karen's influence, once threatening and imposing, had been checked. The garden was secure, but the story was not entirely over. There remained the lingering question: how would Karen respond next? And would the homeowner's careful strategies be enough to withstand her next move? The vote had ended, the garden had survived, and the neighborhood had witnessed a rare victory of strategy over intimidation. But as the shadows lengthened, it was clear that the final confrontation still lay ahead, waiting to test the homeowner's ingenuity and patience one last time. End of Chapter 5. Next. Chapter 6 will reveal the final blow, how the homeowner consolidates their victory, and Karen's ultimate defeat. Chapter 6, The Final Blow. The neighborhood had entered a period of cautious quiet after the vote. The garden had survived, the HOA had upheld the homeowner's right to maintain it, and Karen's influence had been significantly diminished. Yet the homeowner knew better than to assume that persistence alone would vanish overnight. Karen was tenacious, and even in defeat, she plotted subtle ways to reclaim authority. But the homeowner had learned lessons from the previous confrontations. Preparation, strategy, and careful observation were far more powerful than anger or intimidation. Every move Karen had made was documented, every previous complaint catalogued, and every interaction analyzed for potential leverage. The homeowner had transformed not only the garden but also their approach to neighborhood conflicts into a disciplined system of defense. One morning, the homeowner noticed small changes in the garden: footprints in newly planted soil, a slightly shifted decorative rock. Karen was testing boundaries again, seeking any pretext to lodge another complaint. Yet unlike before, the homeowner was ready. Every plant, every feature, every inch of soil was accounted for in the carefully maintained records. What might have been grounds for dispute in the past was now fully protected by rules, precedent, and visual documentation. Instead of reacting emotionally, the homeowner used these minor intrusions as evidence. Each attempt by Karen to manipulate the rules backfired, as the homeowner presented proof of compliance to the HOA, demonstrating that even minor adjustments to the garden remained within regulations. Karen's efforts became increasingly futile, her credibility eroding further with every unsuccessful complaint. Neighbors, who had initially been unsure, began to notice the pattern. Karen's aggression, once intimidating, now appeared obsessive and unbalanced. The homeowner's calm and methodical approach not only protected the garden but also influenced the community's perception. Conversations shifted from curiosity to quiet admiration. People began to recognize the homeowner as someone who understood not only the rules but also the subtle dynamics of influence and fairness within the neighborhood. Emboldened by this support, the homeowner began subtle enhancements to the garden, each one strategically selected to remain fully compliant but visually undeniable. Native plants were clustered in vibrant patterns, decorative borders highlighted adherence to guidelines, and pathways were designed to show intentional planning rather than chaotic growth. Each addition was a silent statement: the garden was more than just a collection of plants, it was a masterclass in rule-informed creativity. Karen's next move was predictable but ineffective. She attempted to rally neighbors, appealing to conformity and the spirit of the community's standards. But her arguments, once persuasive in their emotional intensity, now fell flat against the homeowner's documented compliance and growing neighborhood support. The HOA, increasingly aware of her repeated, unsubstantiated complaints, began to side silently with the homeowner, refusing to take action against a fully defensible garden. The final blow came not from confrontation but from the undeniable clarity of preparation. By systematically documenting compliance, leveraging past precedents, and maintaining composure, the homeowner had transformed the garden into a legally untouchable and aesthetically celebrated space. Karen's influence crumbled as neighbors recognized the futility of her continued interference. Even the most loyal supporters of uniformity could not dispute the meticulous, rule-abiding brilliance of the homeowner's approach. In the weeks that followed, the garden flourished with renewed vibrancy. Bees, butterflies, and birds thrived, oblivious to the human drama that had unfolded around them. The homeowner walked among the blooms, each plant now a testament to patience, strategy, and quiet resilience. The confrontation with Karen, while exhausting, had proven a profound truth: preparation, knowledge, and calm determination could overcome even the most persistent opposition. Karen's presence remained in the neighborhood, but her power had been decisively curtailed. The homeowner's victory was complete, not only in defending the garden but in reshaping the community's understanding of individuality and compliance. The garden stood as a symbol of clever strategy and resilience, a reminder that rules could be leveraged to protect creativity rather than suppress it. The story of the garden, the conflict, the votes, and the final resolution became part of neighborhood lore. Karen's attempts to dominate through intimidation and subjective complaints had failed, and the homeowner's intelligent, patient approach ensured that the wild, vibrant garden would continue to thrive for years to come. The final blow was not a single act of retaliation, but the culmination of careful planning, unwavering composure, and the quiet power of knowledge. The garden, now untouchable and celebrated, remained a living testament to ingenuity. Karen had struck first, she had struck back, but ultimately, the homeowner had turned every challenge into opportunity. The battle was over. The victory was complete. And the garden, beautiful, wild, and rule-abiding, stood triumphant, a symbol of strategy, resilience, and the ultimate triumph over petty conflict. End of Chapter 6, The Conclusion. The HOA saga had reached its conclusion. The homeowner's careful planning and understanding of the rules had ensured the garden's survival, while Karen's attempts at intimidation were finally neutralized.